Harriet is a water and natural resources attorney with Hagaman Law in Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming. And we mentioned this earlier, she's back with us this year. She did a great job regulation without representation last year. There's some things in here that are absolutely stunning. We need to document and get these out. She's been refining her presentation. It's very, very good. It was very good last year, and I hear it's even better now. We really appreciate you coming back to be with us this year, and take it away, Harriet.
Thank you.
Welcome, Harriet.
Thank you. I have my Wyoming supporters. Yes, I'm Harriet Hageman. I'm a water and natural resource attorney in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I practice in Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. I've been doing this for going on 28 years, and in that role, I've had an opportunity to deal a lot with the federal government. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
All right, is that a little better? I hate to use microphones. Usually I'm so loud you don't need them, but how's that? All right, perfect.
I don't think it's turned off.
Now it's on. Now you can hear me. All right, wonderful. I'm going to be talking to you today about regulation without representation. And I did do a similar presentation last year. And it's given me an opportunity to go back and look at the situation that we were dealing with last year, and then some of the changes that have occurred over the last year. First of all, I want to have a quote here. The two enemies of the people are criminals and government, so let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so that the second will not become the legalized version of the first. Wow. He was a very prescient gentleman, wasn't he? And when we must wait for Washington to tell us when to sow and when to reap, we shall soon want for bread. Yes. Again, a very interesting comment in light of what I do and what so many of you do, and the reason that we're here talking about federal lands and the reason as to why they should be transferred to the states. We ought to be looking at a completely different type of management model. Let's look at the economic situation as of where we are.
Go back just a second. I missed that one.
That I can do that.
You can't pass Jefferson.
That's right.
Absolutely. And usually it's put up on my website pretty quickly after I do one of these presentations, and it's just HagamanLaw.com, I think. I never go to it, so I have no idea. But you can find me, and you can find my website. All right, let's look at the financial situation as of yesterday. Federal government debt, $19.706 trillion. I will warn you ahead of time, this is not the happiest speech you're ever going to hear in your life, but you are going to get a lot of facts and information. As of a year ago when I was here, it was $18.4 trillion. It's gone up $1.3 trillion in 12 months, 13 months. 3 years ago, it was $16.9 trillion. In other words, it's gone up $1 trillion every year for the last 3 years. It's $60,000 per citizen, $165,000 per taxpayer. That's a number that ought to frighten everybody in this room. It increases around $3.5 billion every single day. And this is information from the U.S. debt clock. There we go. Let's talk about a bit more. Actually, the debt is over $66 trillion if you take into consideration our unfunded liabilities. That's $204,000 per citizen. It's $806,000 per family. As of a year ago, it was $65 trillion. And as of June 23rd, 2015, it was $61 trillion. One of the things that's interesting about watching the debt clock is you can kind of see what's going on back in Congress and what they are releasing in terms of information to the citizenry. And every once in a while, you'll see some really bizarre jumps and changes. And that's when I start scouring the newspapers and magazines and different resources to find out what they're trying to bury, what they're trying to hide from us, because that's a lot of what this is about in terms of hiding those real numbers. The 110th Congress, which was from 07 to 09, increased the debt by $1.957 trillion. You can look at those numbers. The 113th Congress from 2013 to 2015 added almost $2 trillion to the overall debt. From 11 to 13, $4 trillion was added. As of December 2015, Congress approved a $1.1 trillion spending package, the omnibus spending bill. Debt has increased over $9 trillion since 2009. President Obama's federal budget for fiscal year 2013 was 3.8, 2014 3.9, 2015, 2016 4. We are entering an era where we are at $4 trillion in annual spending every year. The CBO projects that our deficits each year will exceed $1 trillion by 2022, and the total annual spending is estimated to be $5.8 trillion in 2024. Keep in mind that's less than 8 years away. That is the kind of spending that our government is doing. Now, what I think is important about this, and I think it's a part of the message that we need to be getting out there, is that while it is bad to have the deficit and it is bad to have the debt, and obviously we are the largest debtor nation on earth, and actually the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, what is significant about it is that our leaders, or so-called leaders, use this spending to cover up really bad policies. And that is where the debt and the deficit becomes so damaging, is that by their deficit spending, by increasing the debt in the manner that they have been covering up the fact that they have failed to properly manage our federal lands. They have covered up the fact that they have failed in terms of attempting to dictate education in this country. They have failed in terms of the war on poverty. They have failed in terms of our infrastructure. And they have failed, and they cover it up because they just simply continue to spend money rather than addressing what they need to address. This is something that I just added and spent some time working on yesterday. And after listening to the two gentlemen speak before me, by the way, your speeches were absolutely fabulous. I have the books, I use that information, and I am excited to take some of the information that you presented in your PowerPoint. I put this in as the California example because we asked, where does the money go? Where is this money going? And what you realize is that this money is not going towards good forest management. This money is not going towards highway construction. This money is going to salaries. This money is going to benefits. What we have done is we have created an entire class of people that are called federal employees. And those federal employees, their number one job is what? To keep their job. That is their number one job. So every decision that they make every single day is to make sure that they keep their jobs. So if they have to destroy our national forests in the process, if they close roads, if they get involved in litigation, it's job security. And I think that until we as a citizenry recognize the importance of that construct that has been created in this country, we're not going to be able to address or deal with all of these other issues. I think it is fundamental and foundational to understand that many people who work for the Forest Service are not nearly as incensed as we are about the destruction of the national forests. And if they are, it is lip service, because we know how to fix these problems, don't we? We're a very innovative people. Look what we've done in this country. Look what we've created over the last 240 years. Think about what we have done in terms of our highways and in terms of managing the resources we do. Yet here in 2016, we watch our national forests go up in smoke. We watch as our logging towns are devastated economically because of bad policy coming out of Washington, D.C. We know how to fix these problems, yet we don't. And I'm going to tell you that it is the California model that has gone crazy. California's government, like the federal government and most other state and local governments, spends its monies on salaries, benefits, pensions, and other forms of employee compensation. In other words, our taxes go to support a welfare state. We need to understand that if we're going to battle these other issues. So, where are we here? Regulation without representation. What do I mean by that? We fought a war over this. We fought a war against Great Britain. It was called taxation without representation. We said, if you're going to tax us, we We get a voice in our government. And they said, no, not really, you don't. And we said, okay, then you're not going to be in our country anymore. And we fought and we won. And we got independence. Independence, no taxation without representation. Yet that is exactly what is happening right now with the regulatory environment that we live in. We have regulation without representation. We have an executive branch. That's the presidents and our governors. We have our legislative branch. That is the body. Those are the bodies that are closest to the people. They are our representatives. We do not have a democracy, no matter how many people say we have a democracy. We have a republic. We are a representative form of government, and our legislators, such as so many of you here who are county commissioners and legislators, you are the closest to us. You are the most responsive, the most reactive. You are the people who are answerable to us. And if we don't like what you're doing, we should be able to fire you. And we do. People can be unelected. We can run against people. And we have a representative form of government because you are supposed to be, as our county commissioners and as our legislators, you are supposed to be answerable to us. But guess what we have? We also have federal and state agencies. And that's where things have gone south. So here's just a primer. All of you remember this from civics class when you were in grade school and junior high. We have the state legislature, we have the statutes, you have the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, etc. But then what we've done is we have the regulations, and those come from the executive branch, the president and the governors, and they are developed by the agencies. But here is what has happened over time. This is called what I would refer to as legislative malpractice. We have so many of our legislators and our Congress, and I'm going to pick on Congress, not at the state level. The state level, we really do have a voice, a say in what goes on in our states. At the congressional level and at the national level, not so much. But what you have is you have a Congress that passes FLIPMA, for example. And you read the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and what does it say? The Secretary shall have the authority to adopt whatever regulations are necessary to carry out the intent of this act. For goodness sakes, what a horrible thing to write. What a total and complete abdication of responsibility. We can't do it at the federal level, and we shouldn't do it at the state level either. Do not give nameless, faceless bureaucrats that cannot be fired, do not give them the authority to dictate what laws I have to comply with. And look at what they have done. In 2009, Congress passed 125 bills. There were over 3,500 regulations adopted by federal agencies. Go down to 2015, passed 114 new laws, 3,400 new regulations, 30 rules for every law enacted. We violate the law every single day and don't even know it. And if we are a country of laws, which is what our philosophy is, when you have regulations, when you have that kind of a regulatory burden, you have created a situation where you cannot comply with the laws anymore. In part, many of them contradict each other. They don't even make sense in terms of the kinds of regulations that are being adopted. But what happens? Those regulators are keeping their jobs. Those regulators are ensuring that they have the job security that they need. Agencies do not answer to voters, so the unelected end up doing the majority of the lawmaking. Our elected officials are allowed to avoid making difficult decisions. And I'm going to tell you something, this is intentional. At the national level, it is intentional. It is very easy for our representatives to come home and say, those agencies, how often do you hear it? And you hear it from the Democrats, and you hear it from the Republicans, you hear it from both sides. They have completely abdicated their responsibilities, but it's a lot easier to do. And it's a lot, and there's less accountability. I'm going to give you some more information about the fact that it's actually it's intentional on the part of so many of these representatives in Congress to not have to take responsibility for the decisions that are made. Here's something else that I think that a lot of people are not recognizing, but I am, and it took me a long time to figure this out because I'm not the brightest light on the porch. What happens is that through these regulations, these agencies are actually self-funding themselves, and they're making it so that they are no longer even accountable to Congress. When I have a situation where I've got a landowner up near Worland, Wyoming, who moves an irrigation ditch, the EPA swoops in and attacks him for moving an irrigation ditch, claiming that he violated the Clean Water Act. He affected 2.1 acres of his own private property, and at one point had $65 million in fines that he was facing. We ended up going to trial for 2 weeks. We won. We had a jury. The jury came back and found that he had not violated the Clean Water Act. But in bringing that lawsuit, the EPA really never intended to go to trial. They intended to get a settlement. Whether it is $65,000, or it's $110,000, or it's $127,000, or it's $5.5 million. They're funding themselves. So what you have is agencies that it is in their incentive. They are incentivized to adopt rules and regulations and then find the citizens in violation of them, because then they don't have to go through the hard work of getting Congress to support those agencies or appropriate the funds. So what we have is we have millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars out there that are going to agencies that are not even accounted for as part of their budgets. I have worked on a variety of projects, and several years ago I was working on one involving the Platte River. It ended up being about a $250 million recovery plan related to 4 endangered and 1 threatened species in central Nebraska. Because Wyoming has a variety of reservoirs on the Platte River, we had to be a part of the process. It was called the program, or the MOA at the time. And one day I was meeting with a bunch of Corps of Engineers people. They were the agency that we were working with the Fish and Wildlife Service. They were writing the biological opinion. And I went and I met with them in their offices in Denver. And oh my goodness gracious, they were beautiful. They were just beautiful. I mean, artwork on the walls. And I realized that this was a temporary project. This project was only going to be about 3 to 4 years, because once we entered into the program, once we had the BO and entered into the program, Corps of Engineers wasn't going to be a part of it anymore. So I walked in and I said, so who are you guys sharing your office with? What other agency is in this office? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I assume you're sharing an office. I know that this is an office that's being rented. I assume that it's being shared. And they said, oh no, we set this up entirely for this purpose. And what do? They increase their job security. You have to have an office manager. You have to have somebody who's going to be cleaning the offices. You have to have, they set up a temporary office that was nicer than probably almost anybody's office in this room. And that's what the federal government does. They not only waste money, but they ensure their own future employment. They have every incentive to delay as well. Here's another problem with it, is to go through NEPA, to get an EIS, can take years and years and years. Well, if you wanted to do a logging project on the Shoshone National Forest, it could be 5, 6, 7 years to get your EIS to be able to accomplish that. When in reality, you could have done it in 6 months, right? It's not that complicated. You got roads, you got logging, you got air issues, you got water issues. Pretty flippin' simple, right? It is they have every incentive to delay that 6 and 7 and 8 and 10 years, because while that's going on, they have a job. We have created the most bizarre and Byzantine type of regulatory environment in this country that rewards sloth, it rewards failure, it rewards overspending, it rewards every bad trait out there, and we fund it. And we fund it. We have got to dramatically alter the manner in which we deal with the regulatory environment in this country. And in fact, I think it's absolutely critical to the future of the United States that we address this issue, and we address it soon. We've got to find leaders who are willing to do it, because this is a battle we need to take on. Redundancy. Every state has an EPA or a DEQ. So at the federal level, you've got the EPA, and then you've got the DEQ. You have a DOT at the federal level, you've got a Department of Transportation at the state level, you've got a Department of Education, federal and state, Department of Labor, federal and state, Department of Agriculture, federal and state. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Why do we need all of these federal agencies? Why do we need these federal agencies? We are sovereign. And this is where our legislators come in. Our legislators are going to have to start fighting back hard. They're going to have to fight back. We have a presidential election going on right now, if some of you have noticed. And I cannot predict what is going to happen over the next 4 years. I don't know what's going to happen on November 8th, but I sure as heck cannot predict what is going to happen over the next 4 years. This is the opportunity for the states to stand up and say, no more. We are Idaho, we are Wyoming, we are New Mexico, we are Arizona. We will dictate what our future is. We will dictate what our philosophy is. You're seeing states do it. I don't necessarily agree with the issues that they have chosen. Colorado legalized marijuana. What did the feds say? Nothing. Look at the sanctuary cities. Like I said, I don't necessarily agree with what they've chosen, but what they've done is they have put the federal government back on their heels. They have said on these issues, you will not dictate to us what we are going to do within our borders, right? Why don't we take that model and make it much broader? We need to fight back. Our legislators need to fight back. Our county commissioners need to fight back. The most powerful man or woman in any county ought to be the county sheriff, not the head of the BLM. This is the time. We have an opportunity, regardless of who is elected, we have an opportunity as states to take back the authority that was intended under our form of government and intended by our Constitution, intended by our forefathers, such as Thomas Jefferson. We've got a costly and contradictory and redundant situation. We've got federal regulations for the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Forest Management. We have state regulations for enforcement of the Clean Water Act, game and fish regulations, and management of state forest lands. What else is happening? The state agencies view themselves as branches of the federal government. They lack independence and no protection for state citizens. I cannot tell you the number of times I have gone to state agencies and I have addressed an issue and they have said, yes, but the EPA says. Yes, but the Department of Education says. And I say, well, you don't work for them. You work for me. You don't work for them. But we also need to have governors who are willing to stand up and fight this issue. And we need to have governors who are willing to look at the head of the EPA and say, I'm sorry, you don't tell me what to do. We need to have governors who are willing to fight back, because the reality is this is a house of cards. This is a house of cards. It's unconstitutional, and it is a house of cards. And if you have people push back, if you have the right leaders push back, if you have our states push back and our counties push back, the folks in Washington, D.C. can't fight us. I truly, truly believe that we have the ability to change the trajectory of this country if we take this battle on. Obama's executive order on regulations, it was announced in January of 2011. A government-wide review of the rules already on the books to remove outdated regulations that stifle job creation and make our economy less competitive. So let's see how we did. Pages of federal regulations published in the Federal Register in 2011, 75,770 pages. Millions of hours of annual paperwork burden. When they do a regulation, they have to identify how many hours it is going to take to comply with that particular regulation. In 2011, it was 119 million hours for the citizens of this country to comply with their regulations. And there were 0 economically significant rules repealed in 2011. So let's keep going. Let's see how he's doing. All right, 2012. January 27th, 374 days since the executive order. By January 27th of 2012, just in that first 27 days, he'd already imposed $7.7 billion in new regulatory burdens. 4,456 pages in the Federal Register and 25 million hours of paperwork imposed in the first 27 days of 2012. By June 22nd, 2012, it had been 521 days since President's executive order, and there had been one rule repealed. Spilled milk is no longer considered an oil spill. Job security. Job security. I brought some Federal Registers with me up here. I actually read these sometimes when I have to. They're awful. They are absolutely awful. This is the beginning of the regulatory regime in the United States. This one is from 1936. This is the Federal Register. This is the very early period of time when the president started realizing the kind of power he had with regulations. How many months or years do you think that this book represents for federal regulations for 1936? 6 months. 6 months. All right. Here is one from 2012. How many months or years do you think this represents?
15 minutes.
You're closer. 5 days. 5 days. I usually bring more, but I already got yelled at by the airline yesterday, and they were going to charge me a lot of money. I can't bring all of the books that I typically bring with me. That is 5 days coming out of our federal government. Let's see what the cost of this is. The federal cost to administer and police the regulatory enterprise as of 2015 cost us $63 billion a year. The number of federal regulatory employees is over 300,000 people. It increased 17% under President Obama from 2009 to 2012. The U.S. population as of August was 324 million people. The U.S. workforce is 151 million people, that 47% number. The private sector has 120 million employees, and there are government employees of 23 million. 1 of 6. That's stunning. Do you understand what I mean when I say job security? Do you understand the significance of these numbers and why this is something that has to be battled? Why these are such devastating, these are economically devastating numbers. And it is not a business model that is sustainable in the long run. It is simply not a business model that we can sustain as a country. We're looking at already, many people are paying 40% of federal income taxes. The effective rate is actually higher when you look at what we pay for state taxes, sales taxes, license plates, all of those things. 50 to 60% of our income going to taxes. And this is why. This is why. It's also very important to understand that so many of these regulations are not based upon the law, but are based upon the agency's interpretation of the law. I'm going to read to you what the United States Supreme Court said in a decision called Rapinos. And this was one of the first decisions, or the most recent decision that the Supreme Court issued. I believe it was in 2006. And yes, it's a 2006 decision, and it was one of the first times that the Supreme Court actually ruled against the EPA and the Corps of Engineers on the Clean Water Act case. But I'm going to read to you what the Supreme said about the EPA and the Clean Water Act. The burden of federal regulation on those who would deposit fill material in locations denominated as, quote, navigable waters of the United States is not trivial. It must be a navigable water of the United States because that's what the Clean Water Act requires. In deciding whether to grant or deny a permit, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers exercises the discretion of an enlightened despot, relying on such factors as economics, aesthetics, recreation, and in general the needs and welfare of the people. The average applicant for an individual permit spends 788 days and $271,596 in completing the process, and the average applicant for a nationwide permit, which by definition means there's no environmental impact, spends 313 days and $29,000, not counting costs of mitigation or design changes. Over $1.7 billion is spent each year by the private and public sectors obtaining wetland permits. These costs cannot be avoided because the Clean Water Act imposes criminal liability as well as steep fines of $37,500 per day on a broad range of ordinary industrial and commercial activities. The enforcement proceedings against Mr. Rapinos are a small part of the immense expansion of federal regulation of land use that has occurred under the Clean Water Act without any change in the governing statute. I'm going to repeat that. Without any change in the governing statute during the past 5 presidential administrations. In the last 3 decades, the Corps and the EPA have interpreted their jurisdiction over, quote, the navigable waters of the United States to cover 270 to 300 million acres of swampy lands in the U.S., including half of Alaska and an area the size of California in the lower 48 states. And that was just the beginning. The Corps has also asserted jurisdiction over virtually any parcel of land containing a channel or conduit, whether man-made or natural, broad or narrow, permanent or ephemeral, through which rainwater or drainage may occasionally or intermittently flow. On this view, the federally regulated navigable waters of the United States include storm drains, roadside ditches, ripples of sand in the desert that may contain water once a year, and lands that are covered by floodwaters once every 100 years. Because they include the land containing storm sewers and desert washes, the statutory navigable waters of the United States engulf entire cities and immense arid wastelands. In fact, the entire land area of the United States lies in some drainage basin, and an endless network of visible channels furrows the entire surface, containing water ephemerally wherever the rain falls. Any plot of land containing such a channel may potentially be regulated as a navigable water of the United States. Now, remember those numbers. To get a 404 permit costs an average of $271,000, and it's 788 days. Now, guess who gets that money? And guess who is spending that 788 days? Your federal employees. Job security. The healthcare law is another example. The power of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The Obamacare law was 2,700 pages. Lawyers drafted over 20,000 pages of regulations for implementation, 13,000 pages alone by December of 2012. There are in excess of 180 boards, commissions, and bureaus. There are 18 pages in the Federal Register to define what a full-time employee is, now reduced to 30 hours per week. And the IRS estimate is that it will take 80 million hours for families and businesses to comply with Obamacare taxes. Seriously, 80 million hours? And here's one thing I gotta ask. If Congress passes a law that is 2,700 pages long, don't you think that that would be sufficient to tell us what we can and cannot do? Who in the world would need 20,000 additional pages to dictate how it is going to be implemented? That is an absurdity. Interpretation continued. Greenwire. Joe Goffman. I read this a while back and it made me sick to my stomach. Joe Goffman is the US EPA's law whisperer. His specialty is teaching an old law to do new tricks. Personally, I didn't know that's what laws are for. And I also didn't know that that's what regulators were for. I thought that it was like for dogs. I wasn't aware that we could teach laws new tricks. Goffman is gearing up the 1970 Clean Air Act to be the vehicle for curbing power plants' greenhouse gas emissions. But with no congressional action likely anytime soon to address climate change, Goffman's back at EPA to help shape a new rule for working power plant fleets under a rarely used section of the Clean Air Act. Goffman has a sense of vocation to the Clean Air Act. He has been working on the law and its associated regulations for 30 years, often focusing on problems that were not envisioned in the original law and thus require new tools. Now again, I'm going to repeat, we're a republic. We elect our representatives to make the law, not Mr. Joe Goffman, the law whisperer. This is how corrupt this has become. They are bragging about the fact that they are using the words on a page in a book called the U.S. Code, and they're using those words to create whatever gobbledygook that they want to. It doesn't matter what the words on the page say. They see black and they see white, and they say, oh, okay, well, let's just rewrite it. And this is what is happening. And as a result, we have had, 1 to 2% growth over the last 8 years? And it's not going to get any better. Until we address this, it is not going to get any better. But here's what the U.S. Supreme Court says, that an agency may not confer power on itself to permit an agency to expand its power in the face of a congressional limitation on jurisdiction would be to grant the agency power to override Congress. This we are both unwilling and unable to do. Agencies must always give effect to the unambiguously expressed intent of Congress. The power to execute the laws does not include the power to revise clear statutory terms that turn out not to work in practice. What happened with the second Obamacare lawsuit? What happened? The Supreme Court actually ruled that despite what the words of the act said, they could allow federal funds to be used in those states that did not set up their own exchanges, because that would have been the intent of the law had they thought that the states wouldn't actually comply with what they were demanding that they do. This is a travesty, what has happened. Agencies should not be writing law. Here's some examples of regulatory overreach. Have we gone crazy? The Pythagorean theorem, 24 words. First Amendment to the United States Constitution, one of my favorite pieces of work in history. 45 words, the Lord's Prayer, 66 words. The Ten Commandments, 179 words. Gettysburg Address, greatest speech of all time, one of the greatest speeches of all time, 286 words. Declaration of Independence, 1,300. The U.S. government regulations on cabbage crop insurance, 3,500 words. The U.S. Constitution, 7,800 words. And the U.S. government regulations on special rules for experimental populations of threatened and endangered wildlife and plants, over 36,000 words. The federal worker safety laws include some 4,000 rules dictating precisely what equipment shall be used and how facilities are built. For example, it requires that stairways shall be lit by natural or artificial illumination. All right, what's my third choice? I mean, I looked at that and I thought, really, somebody wrote that? They did, somebody wrote that. My goodness gracious, you want to know what really bothers me about that, though? It isn't that it's absolutely absurd and stupid, it's how they view us. Those regulators actually believe that we are so stupid, we're going to build a building, and then we're going to walk down the stairs and we're going to say, oh my goodness gracious, there's no light in here. I wish I had a federal regulator tell me that I needed either natural or artificial illumination because this isn't working well. I have to read something to you. I really do. I wasn't going to, but I have to, because I was just reading it a moment ago, and it made me laugh. And we have to have some levity with this horrible speech I'm giving. The government has published detailed instructions on how to safely roast marshmallows. This is coming out of the Department of Ag, and I was worried we wouldn't have something like this, but fortunately we do. The U.S. Forest Service on Friday published a nearly 700-word article on how to safely roast marshmallows, all in preparation for Saturday, which is National Roasted Marshmallow Day. As one might expect, the article is riddled with safety tips that might make you think twice about even carrying matches into the forest at all, let alone actually igniting a marshmallow and putting your family's life at risk. First, let's talk safety, the article says. Never start a campfire when there are fire restrictions in place. The restrictions are put in place for the safety of you and others. And then it goes on to talk about how you need to have at least a 10-foot rule between children and a campfire. This is a federal agency, again, job security, telling people about how to roast a marshmallow. And then it says you've got to have a maximum length for a roasting stick and a minimum length for a roasting stick. And then it finally says, how about if you just eat fruit instead? That's a healthier option. I know, it is funny. It really is funny. That is our federal government at work. What did I show you? $20 trillion in debt? That's our federal government at work. All right, I've got to do one more. A magician has been ordered to pull a rabbit disaster plan out of his hat after he was forced to buy a special bunny license. Again, it's your Department of Agriculture. And what happened here was that a gentleman, a magician in Texas, was doing a magic show. And there was a woman from the Department of Ag who was at the magic show. And after his show, he was talking with some of the parents and children, and she busted him, and she nailed him for not having a license for his bunny. And what she said was he had to have a rabbit disaster plan in place by July 29, 2013 in case of a calamity such as flooding, earthquake, landslide, mudslide, avalanche, wildfire, intentional attack. Those are some of the examples of why he had to have a rabbit management plan in place. This is a regulation. It truly is. It's been published in this book. So what he said is, she said that my country is broke, Mr. Hahn says. We're out of money, and now the government is spending time and money worrying about an emergency plan for a bunny rabbit. But Before there ever was a plan or a need for one, there was the rabbit license. Charlie Casey's predecessor, the backbone, he failed to get the rabbit license, so he got fined for that. And he says that, what he said is I didn't even use Charlie in that particular show when she showed up, but she busted me anyway. I did the show, and Mom's always come up to talk to me, and she came up and busted him for not having a license. I told her I could understand needing a license if I was using tigers, but I was using a bunny rabbit, a 3-pound bunny rabbit. Even bunnies, the one rabbit magician soon learned, needed USDA approval, a process that involved filling out multiple forms and getting Charlie examined by a vet, and exercise and bureaucratic oversight that repeats itself annually. Every year he has to get a bunny license. He's also subject to surprise visits to make sure that the bunny is okay. So then he didn't have his evacuation plan for the bunnies. So he said, it's called common sense. He says, we live in Missouri. We have tornadoes here, so we have a safe room in our basement. I told the USDA supervisor that I spoke with that if there is a tornado, my 12-year-old Chihuahua, who's really our baby, is first in, and then the cats. And if there's time, I'll grab the rabbit. And we'd all go to the safe room. But the supervisor told me that the rabbit, being the only licensed animal, is the most important one in her eyes, and that was the one he had to worry about. I can't make this up. I would if I could. I can't, because it's too absurd. You don't need to. You don't need to. Under a recent federal directive, the number of healthcare reimbursement categories will increase from 18,000 to 140,000, including 21 separate categories for spacecraft accidents and 12 for beach stays. This is the federal government at work. This is one that I love because I've still never been able to figure it out. Administrative simplification. This is a Health and Human Services regulation for administrative simplification. Adoption of operating organizations for operating rules and adoption of operating rules for eligibility and claim status. That's to simplify things. I seriously have never been able to figure out what that means. It is just a word salad. That's regulation. It is just absurd. The hidden indirect costs. This is where the taxes, this is where the money side comes in, and this is what drives me crazy. We have taxes, and taxes have to be disclosed. The regulatory impact does not. In 1992, the regulatory costs in this country were $400 billion. As of 2015, they were $2 trillion. That is a hidden tax that is imposed on us every single year by our federal government. Every single year. So when I give you those numbers at the beginning, and then you realize that this is going on, you can understand why our economy has been affected the way that it has. 2012, our income taxes were over $1.1 trillion. 2015 income tax receipts over $3.1 trillion coming into the government. 2016 income tax receipts as of 10/19 was $3.28 trillion this year already. The only time that a regulatory cost has to be exposed is if it's going to be over $100 million, have an impact of over $100 million. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I think $100 million is a lot of money. I think if it's going to have an impact of $10 million on the American public, it ought to be disclosed, or $20 million. Give me a number that isn't $100 million, because this is also self-reporting by agencies, and the statistical analyses they've been able to do is that on average they underestimate the cost of a regulation by 40%. So really every time they come out and say it's a $100 million impact, you know it's a $140 million impact. The estimated cost of regulation is equivalent to 1/2 of federal spending. Our regulatory costs amount to 11% of the U.S. GDP. In absolute terms, the U.S. government is the largest government on planet Earth. Regulations and deficits each exceed $1 trillion per year, and the regulatory costs rival corporate pre-tax profits of $2 trillion. Combined with $3.6 trillion of federal spending, Washington, D.C.'s share of the economy now reaches over 31%. This is where our state legislators have got to step in. This is where I do believe that we have the ability to get some reform, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. I'm just going to throw it out there because it's a really exciting idea, and it's called tax reform. I know that it isn't the most exciting topic, but it is truly, we've got to start the beast. We have got to start the beast. We are to the point now that if we do not change this model and this construct, we are a socialist country. We are moving to the point where the federal government is dictating pretty much every aspect of our lives on so many different levels. In 2015, if the U.S. regulations were a country, they would have been the 9th largest economy, ranked between India and the head of Russia. The House of Representatives has passed almost 40 bills to control regulatory expansions, and the Senate continues to refuse to take them up. Regulatory costs amount to an average of $14,000 per household, 22% of the average household income of $66,000. It exceeds every item of the household budget except for housing. Small businesses pay more. I can attest to this. I have my own law firm. I have 3 employees and myself. And the regulatory burden, forms and things that I have to fill out simply to hire a staff person and 2 attorneys and to keep them employed, the paperwork I send in every month, whether it's to the Department of Workforce Services or it's just unending. It really is. Regulatory costs per employee per year for manufacturers. $19,000 average for all manufacturers. We talk all the time about we don't have manufacturing in this country. I know why. It's easy. It is easy. It is easy to figure out. We've broken them. We just flat broke them. The administration, the regulatory costs, the future costs of the current agenda. This administration averaged 81 economically significant each year from 2009 to 2015. That means they would have, each of them would have over $100 million in impacts or costs associated with them. 81 every single year for the last 6 years. As of August 9th, 2016, the total number was a record-breaking 600 in 7.5 years. The federal government is open approximately 250 days, which means they're passing, adopting, enforcing a major federal regulation every 3 days, 2 per week. The total cost of at least $743 billion, larger than the GDP of Norway and Israel combined. 194 million hours of additional paperwork. It would take 97,000 employees working full-time to comply with these new federal regulations. Of the 3,297 rules in the pipeline as of the fall of 2015, 218 were economically significant. Your 6 most active agencies are what you see up there. Please note the EPA has refused to share with Congress the data upon which it bases its claims of hundreds of billions of dollars in health benefits. That's one of the things they do. They claim that they're doing a cost-benefit analysis, but then they won't ever produce the information to Congress demonstrating that there are benefits associated with their regulations. Recent activities, the definition of the waters of the United States, that is being decided in the 6th Circuit, potentially. I was involved in that. I was hired by the Wyoming Association of Conservation Districts. We were successful in getting a stay on the rule in 13 western states. So that rule cannot go forward in the western states right now, but it is on appeal in the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. The 6th Circuit has claimed to take original jurisdiction, which I have scoured everything I can find, and there's no reason as to why the 6th Circuit would have original jurisdiction over a case like this. What they're trying to do is prevent there from being a split in the district so that it would go up to the Supreme Court. If one appellate court is the only court that can decide the case, the Supreme Court may very well never hear it, depending upon what the outcome is. The 6th Circuit is in the eastern United States. It's Michigan, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas. Obviously not one of the western states. I'm very concerned as to what the 6th Circuit is going to do. I think this is a setup. But at least the judge in North Dakota has issued a stay. We'll see what happens with that. Greenhouse gas rules, the ozone rule, it's going to reduce GDP by $140 billion per year. It'll reduce GDP $1.7 trillion from 2017 to 2024. It will result in 1.4 million fewer job equivalents, cost the average household $830 per year in lost consumption. It would be the most expensive standard in U.S. history. EPA regulation of carbon, destroy 1.4 million jobs, 200,000 manufacturers, 2015 to 2016. 2026, the average annual impact of carbon regulation will be more than 500,000 jobs. And there will be no significant impact on reducing greenhouse gas emission growth. But we are making an example worldwide. The Obama administration destroys Peabody Energy. That's what I'll discuss. This is where the cost comes in. Largest coal company filed for bankruptcy in the spring of 2016. Its demise would cost 125,000 jobs, 650 billion in economic activity. According to the American Action Forum, Obama, Department of Interior, and EPA have added 312 billion in costs, along with 30 million hours of additional paperwork to keep up with regulations. The cross-state pollution rule and mercury and air topic standard would impose 20 billion in annual regulatory costs. The Supreme Court has issued a stay on those. Before the end of the year, these are the additional ones that are in the pipeline that Obama is trying to get through by the end of the year: greenhouse gas standards, federal policy for protection of human subjects, efficiency standards for manufactured housing. Now look at that second one. Federal policy for the protection of human subjects. First of all, I'm really horrified that somebody calls me a subject. I mean, for goodness sakes, how bizarre do you have to get that your government is calling these folks a human subject? But why is there a regulatory cost of $13.3 billion? What would be your regulatory cost of attempting to address, say, slavery in the Sudan? What is the U.S. regulatory cost? Where are our, what is the cost? It's purely employees. There isn't anything else. These are the things, they adopt regulations, and again, it's the job security.
And that's 40% off.
Yeah, and that's 40% off. That's exactly right. The so-called Clean Power Plan, the first direct regulation of greenhouse gas emissions for power plants at a cost of $7.2 billion a year. Despite the cost, the plan will do nothing to mitigate global warming. That's according to the Daily Signal. The EPA in February 2012 adopted the MACT, Maximum Achievable Control Technology, the cost of $9.6 billion. Now, one of the other things agencies are required to do is that cost-benefit analysis. And according to the EPA, the cost of the rule exceeds the benefits by between 1,600 to 1 and 19,000 to 1. So for every $1 of benefit, it is going to cost $19,000 is one of the ways to look at that. Their own agency said that that was the cost-benefit analysis of that rule. Now, I don't know, I'm going to use just a bit of common sense up here. I don't think I would have adopted that one. I think I would have passed on that one as soon as I did my cost-benefit analysis, because that's an absurdity. But it's other people's money. It's taxpayer money. It's the regulatory, it's the cost of permitting. It's all of those things. It's keeping the agency employed. Agency employees employed. Electrical rates to skyrocket, and they have skyrocketed. We're seeing fuel poverty. For many of us, we can afford this. But for those who can't, this is one of the cruelest things I think I've ever seen a government do. Right now, they're talking about doing away with, there's the war on air conditioning, I guess you could say, and that's the most recent effort to curb greenhouse gases in this so-called global warming that was fabricated in order to cover up a lot of the stuff that our government is doing, but that's an aside. Anyway, with that, how many years have we been encouraging people to move to Arizona, to move to Florida, to move to Texas? How many people are they willing to kill? All in in this idea of fighting global warming, because that is the reality. It is the reality for older folks that wouldn't have air conditioning. This, to me, is one of the most bizarre things that our governments across the world are doing, and I'll explain that with this next one. Look at Europe's folly. Opportunity cost for the United Kingdom subsidy system for renewables is estimated to be 10,000 jobs. Planned offshore wind farm estimated to cost $8,972 per household. The cost of conventional energy was $448. Spain's subsidies for renewable energy led to the loss of 110,000 jobs. Now, how often have we heard about what is going on in places such as Spain, their economic situation? They're continuing to go forward with this. Now, again, you would think that some leader somewhere would stand up and say, you know, until we've got a better economic climate, perhaps this is not the time to be doing this to our citizenry. And nobody will. They continue to stand up and walk down the road of fighting global warming. For any of you who read Don Quixote, you will understand why they're doing it. Europe's folly continued. You know, Great Britain could be facing blackouts and extremely expensive electricity this winter. A report published in June 2016 estimates that the price of electricity could be more than 12 times higher than usual. The government intends to close remaining coal power plants over the next 10 to 15 years, taking 24,000 megawatts of generational capacity off of the grid. The UK government estimates that green energy taxes attached to electricity bill costs resident and businesses $6.1 billion annually. The cost of saving the world from global warming. Even if every nation in the world adhered to its claim change commitments by 2030, the only difference in global warming by the end of this century will be to reduce the world's temperature by 0.048 degrees Celsius. These are not my numbers. These are their numbers. They admit that this is the outcome if every country destroyed their economy to further the agenda of global warming. Yes.
John Kerry at CCAR pulpit, COP 21, said this will have no effect.
No effect.
No effect.
So what is the purpose? Again, I think those are some of the things that we as citizens need to try to figure out. What is going on with our government and why? What is the intent of this? Because anybody with a lick of sense wouldn't do this. You couldn't walk down this road if you truly understood human nature, if you actually truly cared about your citizenry, if you were attempting to make sure that we were pulling people out of poverty, you wouldn't do these things. So what do we need to figure that out. We need to be working together to figure that out. Not at the estimated cost, $1.5 trillion, not counting premature deaths killed by fuel poverty, birds sliced and diced by windmills, or burnt to a crisp by solar panels, assault on economic progress, etc. The Endangered Species Act and critical habitat designations. This is from the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service has come out in a regulation and stated, designating critical habitat does absolutely no good. It provides no benefits to the species themselves. A number of studies have found that critical habitat designations has no discernible influence on whether a species status is declining, stable, or improving. That's according to the Reason Foundation. Regulatory burdens affect 60 million acres of land in this country, 83,000 miles of streams, creeks, rivers, 68,000 acres of lakes, oceans, estuaries, designations in 37 states. Just the impact of having that, the critical habitat designations, and the agency itself says, doesn't do any good. Does not do any good. In 30 years of implementing the Act, the service found that the designation of statutory critical habitat provides little additional protection to most listed species while consuming significant amounts of available conservation resources. The service's present system provides little real conservation benefit. That's published in the Federal Register in case you wanted to go look at that. Federal Register, just a glance, we'll go through this quickly. 2015, the Federal Register, 80,000 pages, the third highest in history. 2014, 78, 2013, 79,000, 2012, 78, 2010, 81, that's an all-time high. 2011, 81, 247. Among the 7 all-time high Federal Register page counts, 6 have occurred under President Obama. The impact of his presidency is going to be felt long after he is out of office. Because once a regulation is in place, you can't get rid of it. The courts have become very, very, very deferential to agencies. Whenever you go to trial against the federal government, you don't start out here. You're not equal. The federal government's up here, you're down here. And you have to spend quite a bit of your time just trying to get back to equilibrium and then hopefully be able to win. It's very, very, very difficult, costly. Mental health issues for me, trying cases against the federal government. It is not an easy task to do. They have unlimited resources. But the costs of over-regulation are not just monetary, and that's where some of your photographs came in today that I think are so critically important. They destroyed our national forests. The 2001 roadless rule, the GAO reports, what I'm referring to there is I sued the federal government, I sued the Forest Service, I was hired by the state of Wyoming to sue over the roadless rule in 2001. And we filed a lawsuit against the 2001 roadless rule and we won. We had a federal district court judge issue an injunction against it. One of the things that happened during that is I got the administrative record that was the basis for the roadless rule. And there's some very important and interesting data in there, including the source or the ground zero for the pine beetle outbreak and what happened with that. I ended up getting 2 GAO reports, one from 1999 and one from 2000, because Congress actually was attempting to do its job a bit more back then, and they required the Forest Service to do they had 2 GAO analysis done because the roadless rule denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of National Forest Service lands of the total of 192 million. And in these GAO reports, there was some very interesting information that was published, and I'm going to read it to you. The proposed roadless rule takes an approach to decision-making on road construction in roadless areas that is different from the approaches of other recent Forest Service proposed rules, strategies, and plans. The proposed rule, what the agency asserts would supersede relevant portions of existing plans and transportation management regulations, would apply a nationwide prohibition on road construction in roadless areas, even if local conditions suggested that a road would help the agency to restore and maintain desired ecological conditions. So even though a road would improve the environment, the roadless rule was designed to prohibit it from being constructed. The exceptions would not authorize road construction or reconstruction in inventoried roadless areas to restore and maintain ecological sustainability. So anytime anybody wants to tell me that the Forest Service does a good job of management, their very intent is not to. Their very intent is not to protect the environment. Their very intent is to control lands. Therefore, national forests could generally not construct a road to thin stands of trees and mechanically remove underbrush and dead vegetation to reduce the risk of uncontrollable and potentially catastrophic fire, or to improve the forest's resistance to insects and diseases that otherwise could kill trees and add to fuel loads. In other words, they knew exactly what was going to happen. And all of the photographs that you have showing the destruction, they knew it was, they recognized that the roadless rule was going to do this. What's significant, though, is that they finally did explain what happened with the beetle outbreak. Officials on several national forests included in our review voiced concerns about the long-term impacts of the roadless rule. Officials on the Route National Forest anticipate an outbreak of pine beetles resulting from a catastrophic windstorm in 1997 that felled 13,000 acres of mostly spruce and fir trees in or adjacent to roadless areas on the forest. They believe that the preferred alternative would not allow them to construct the roads necessary to remove trees in roadless areas that in the future may become infected by the beetles currently living within this deadfall. Therefore, they would be unable to protect highly valued resources such as scenic areas and adjacent campgrounds and ski slopes. I was ground zero for the pine beetle outbreak. All of the dead trees in my lifetime, they destroyed my national forests. They knew that that was going to happen. Route National Forest was ground zero. And you go into Wyoming, into southern Wyoming, Yellowstone National Park, you look at the national forests throughout the western United States. They knew what was going to happen if they did not go in and clean up that area. And with the adoption of the roadless rule, they were not allowed to. So we have the actual evidence of our federal government and the destruction that they caused. So while we can talk about the monetary side of it, they're also destroying our environment. And that is the message. That is the message that we have got to get out there. We have got to be doing a better job of educating our young. We've got to be doing a better job of educating our teachers. We've got to be doing a better job of educating our leaders, our county commissioners, because the federal government has not been a friend to the environment, at least not in the western United States. In 2016, the U.S. Forest Service warns that it is at a tipping point of a crisis dealing with escalating wildfire and diseases. There were 10.1 million acres torched last year. They blame everything on global warming rather than their own failed policies. They refuse to acknowledge that federal policy prohibits the use of crop thinning and other techniques, too many trees competing for a limited water supply, etc. And they plead for more funding from Congress because, of course, money is always going to solve this long-standing problem. The ag industry, that's another one that they're going after, additional impacts of overregulation. Department of Labor's effort to ban anyone under 16 from working on farms and ranches. I don't know if you knew, but the Department of Labor had adopted in 2012 a rule saying anyone under 16 years old cannot work on a farm and ranch. Okay, I grew up on a ranch. My brothers and sisters, my cousins, my nieces and nephews, they're all, many of them are in the ag industry. Think about the sociological impact of this. Think about why would the Department of, first of all, why in the world would the Department of Labor have such authority? That's an absurdity. But think about it. You're going to have to hire people if you don't have kids. When we all went to college, that's when my dad put in a center pivot because he didn't have us to flood irrigate anymore. You're going to have the labor somewhere, right? And where do we get our labor? We import it. But you're also talking about a cultural issue because kids who are raised on farms and ranches usually are independent. They usually are less inclined to be dependent upon the government. There are many issues associated with that, and you think about just that one rule and the impact it could have on rural communities, and it's just devastating. EPA Clean Water Act actions, ignoring exemptions to the 404, fees imposed on cattle. I'm going to go through this the rest of this very quickly. The mounting pressures to restrain spending budgets. This is what I was talking about earlier. The mounting pressures to restrain spending budgets can incentivize lawmakers to impose off-budget regulations on the private sector rather than add to unpopular deficit spending. Unlike on-budget spending, the regulatory costs remain largely hidden from public view, a feature that can make regulation overly attractive to lawmakers. Keep that in mind when you talk to your senators and representatives and tell them to knock this off. I'm going to wrap this up with a couple of things. The real crisis in this country, I really do believe, remains largely unrecognized. We see a lot of the outcome. We're seeing the results of really bad management and overregulation, but we're not necessarily understanding why those results are happening. We're not tying it to these federal agencies that have just completely run amok and are taking and asserting far more authority than they should. What we need to do is, I think a balanced approach is critical. When the government directs its resources to doing things it should not be doing, it becomes incapable of doing those things that it should. National defense and the Ebola outbreak. You watch our government scrambling, trying to deal with things that they should be able to deal with, but they're too busy studying things like shrimp on treadmills. And truly, the Fish and Wildlife Service studies shrimp on treadmills. I know that's insane, and they do, and they're spending money on that. A government that is closest to the government is more responsive and accountable to the people that it was established to serve. Hello? My legislators, my county commissioners are answerable to me, but nobody in Congress is, and none of these regulators are. There are solutions. There must be an immediate moratorium placed on new regulations. There must be a comprehensive analysis of the ones already on the books. Regulations must clearly state that the statutory language controls regulations, and the regulatory process must be simplified. Congress and state legislators must stop engaging in legislative malpractice, reverse the top-down approach. Tax reform. We're going to have to start starving the beast. I really do think that tax reform is a critical component of this, and we don't talk about it enough, and we need to be making our representatives talk about tax reform. Not to increase it, decrease it. The taxing authority should be at the state level, not at the federal level. Your federal taxes should be at 4 to 5%. All of the states then have the authority to tax based upon what their priorities are and what their citizens' priorities are. One of the problems with creating the federal Leviathan that we have is we've got a problem where Wyoming is being treated like California. We're not California, we don't want to be. If Wyoming is in charge of its own destiny, then we have a safe haven in Wyoming. If we're forced to be like California, we're losing our safe haven. It really is very critical that we get the tax reform and we leave the taxing authority at the state level. We need to ensure that Congress and the legislative oversight for proposed regulations, any regulation that's over $10 million or $50 million or even $100 million cannot go into effect until Congress votes on it and approves it. And you would stop 90% of the regulations coming out of the federal government. If Congress had to vote on those high-end regulations before they went into effect, it would make a huge difference. They don't want that authority. We need to force that authority on them. They need to do that. Mandatory sunsets, small entities to be regulated differently. We need to trust each other also. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we think there has to be a regulation for everything, and that's an absurd approach to take in our form of government. There are certain specific ones to the EPA. We don't have to talk about those. We need to make Congress directly answerable to the voters, and we need to pass the REINS Act. That is the last thing, is that we need to pass the REINS Act. Get a hold of your congressmen, get a hold of your senators, tell them they have to vote in favor of the REINS Act. And then, finally, if you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law. We're well beyond that. So, there you go. Thank you. Yes, Marty.
Okay, this is what we run into daily, Dan and I. We have to pass this law in Cheyenne in order to bring Wyoming into conformity or compliance with a federal regulation, or we will lose X federal dollars. This is what, that's what I say.
Well,
right?
that's one reaction, but here's another. I understand what you're saying with that. There's one thing that came out of this that first Obamacare decision that every state legislator ought to be looking at and evaluating, and that is that there was a mandate that every state had to expand Medicare, or it was going to lose funding, Medicaid, or it was going to lose funding. The U.S. Supremes said that they did not have the authority with that carrot and stick approach. For one of the first times in history, and perhaps it was Roberts trying to cover up the fact that he messed up the entire decision, but what he said was, they can't hold you hostage. We need to start studying that language and applying that language and saying, no, you don't get to take away my funds from the Department of Transportation if I don't pass this law. The Supreme Court says you don't have the legal authority to do that. I know that they've done it in the past. I believe in 1972, Wyoming didn't want to lower its speed limit. And that went to the courts, and they said, you either lower your speed limit or you're going to lose their funding. But there are other things also to keep in mind. I want to know if they're actually appropriately adopted regulations or they are guidelines. You know, all of those dear colleague letters that are coming out of the Department of Education aren't worth the paper they're written on. They have no legal authority whatsoever. You have a president that comes in and wants to do a gun grab with an executive order, no legal authority whatsoever. No state in the nation has to follow that. We have our own constitutional provision about our right to keep and bear arms. He can't, by executive order, change that. So one of the things we need to be looking at is if these are actually adopted rules and regulations, because they're the only thing with force and effective law. But we also need to go back to what Justice Roberts did in the Obamacare decision and say you cannot withhold our funding simply because we won't do what you tell us to do. And then if they still say we're going to pull your funding, let them pull the funding.
Harriet, are you going to be around this afternoon and this evening? Will you be here tomorrow too?
Yes.
Good. So she'll be here, and I'm sure that plenty of you will want to speak with Harriet more. And thank you so much for coming back. That was incredible. Thank you.